Malcha. Welcome back to part 2 of our book, The Brothers. I hope you're enjoying this. I found this fascinating. I tried to do justice to the descriptions of life in Russia and the culture that these kids came from, and I did have to gloss over some of it. I would recommend reading it. It's a very story. It flows really, really well. So, okay, let's move on. Chapter 6, His Place in the World. In 2012, Tamerlan, and now you'll notice these people are constantly moving. It's like this restlessness. They got displaced in a previous generation and they never learned how to settle. Tamerlan went to Dagestan to renew his passport, which is a lie because you don't need to go there to do that. Makakala was now a huge city. It was more orderly. There were more real apartment buildings. All the temporary kiosks were gone. It had been cleaned up a bit. It had a new road. The neighborhoods were more organized around groups of similar people. And there were stores that catered to the different ethnic groups. However, there was a lot of tension between the religious and the secular, between the old Chechens and the young Chechens, between Chechens in general and the Russian federal law enforcement, which was brutal. The Russian feds hunted down Wahhabi radicals. They hounded the young Chechens. Men were arrested and disappeared, or they were arrested and convicted of terrorism, or their home would be attacked like with a SWAT team and they'd be shot in a siege. Every month, some radical was annihilated by the Russian federal troops. Every time some radical was killed, all of his relatives joined the resistance. So it began to radicalize people just by their actions. And they joined a guerrilla war forces in the forest. And this created fear, reasonable fear of escalating violence, which it did. Every week, 1 or 2 cops would be dead in an explosion, a retribution. So there was a slow cycle of war going on. Sociologists describe it as a terror imposed by the government, random applications of extreme brutality, like Stalin's Great Terror. It's ineffective and inefficient, but they do it. Troops needed ongoing conflict, so they elicited this continuing violence. The troops were paid extra if they, like combat hazard pay. And so it benefited them. The longer that they could maintain a siege, the more money they got. And eventually you end up in the situation of slow-rolling permanent war, and the economy simply can't work with this. And there was no consensus on what the law was. The Russian law was not Arat, which was the cultural law, or Sharia, which was the extremist religious law, and there was no consensus. And also, Putin, is coming down, with both feet on them, and decided to appoint his own leadership in even small communities that people did not get to elect. Also, and this we've talked about, and I think this is really important, and we see a parallel here in the United States, where authoritarian leaders start leaning on religious belief to back them up. The Kremlin was relying more and more on the Orthodox Church to control the people, which is ironic given official government stand on religion for many, many, many decades. Suddenly the Orthodox Church and Putin were buddy-buddy, and they still are. The appointed leaders in Dagestan were taking the cue and relying more on the imams. So this is what you get. Tamerlan's peers were undereducated. They saw no future. They had no investments. They had no real jobs. Everything they did was a financial scam of some sort. Moscow had a lot of oil money to give them. And this went into what was essentially a crooked economy. And so all the young men were outlaws of one sort or another. Tamerlan discovered his peers when he went, he was disconnected in Boston. Suddenly he found people his own age who shared his religion, and they talked all day about injustice, and they sat around all day airing their grievances and going to the mosque, which was always overflowing. The imam was 73. He had become an imam at the age of 25, and then when he was first an imam, if you were caught, you would be given 25 years in jail, so it was very much an underground activity. He'd actually worked as a construction worker. If you didn't have a job, the Russian state declared you a parasite, and you were jailed for parasitism. Zubaydat's cousin lived in Kurzlar, and this was now under siege as an insurgent hotspot, as the Chechnyan Muslims were called. It was a 2-hour drive from Makakala. Ethnic groups were slowly taking over land that belonged to Russian occupiers as they died out. So the original Russians who were placed by Stalin in the Chechnyan lands were getting old and dying out. And the youth were all becoming radicalized, and they were taking over this land. There were actually a lot of abandoned farm buildings. Tamerlan's cousin's name was Todashev, and he was the leader of the Union of the Just, which was allied with one of the largest Muslim organizations in the world. They wanted to create a caliphate to unite all Muslim lands. The name of this caliphate would be Hizb ut Tahrir, and they wanted to do it peacefully. They condemned violence. It was seen as a gateway to jihadists. It was banned in Russia, and it became radicalized on the edges, but originally it was considered nonviolent. So the cousin Todashev organized protests against law enforcement detentions and also addressed inequality, social injustice, and he had a very complicated relationship with local law enforcement. Outwardly, the police chief hated him, but he always got inside information from the law enforcement, so the law enforcement was playing both sides. Todashev ended up in prison thousands of miles away from home. And this was quintessential. I have no idea what I meant. Let's see here. The Union of the Just, that Tamerlan discovered he belonged to just by birthright, was a quintessential Dagestan organization, a group of self-important young men who trafficked mostly in words and yet balanced unmistakably at the edge of constant and extreme danger. And he was closest to his cousin, who was deeply, deeply involved in this. He was also closest to Kardashev's deputy, a guy named Godzayev, who Gessen eventually interviewed. So he lived in Makakala. There must be leaves dying on the trees, allergies. So he and Godzayev were similar, Tamerlan and Godzayev. Tamerlan told him that America was racist and divided between the rich and the poor, and xenophobic and in moral decline. But there was freedom of speech, and people were open to people from anywhere, and education was available. They agreed that the United States and Russia were different but similar. They had different flaws, but they were similar in a lot of ways. Foreign policy in Russia was better because they didn't support Israel or secular Arabs. This is the decision they came to. Quote, I refuse to choose between two kinds of fecal matter. So they didn't like either. Godzayev accused Tamerlan of not really having clarity about the Quran. You need to get specific. He told him he saw him as a religious baby. He condescended to him. The question here is, was Tamerlan radicalized in Dagestan? Well, if he had been really, really radicalized, he might have gone to Syria, and he might have gone into the forest and joined the other extremists. But he suddenly claimed he had to go back to the United States because of his documents. But it's not true. He'd been traveling on an American passport, and it was up to date. And his Russian passport was long since expired. He didn't need to go to Dagestan to renew it, and he didn't need to go back to the United States for any obvious purpose. So he was lying about why he went back. Nobody knows why. He was chided by Gadzhiev, go back to the United States and get an education. So 2 months after he left the Union of the Just, they staged a protest criticizing Russia and the U.S., and they burned the U.S. flag. So you might even say that Tsarnaev radicalized them. Chapter 7, Patriots' Day. This is July of 2012. Tamerlan returned to Cambridge. Zubiet went to Dagestan. Incredible. Anzor was in Dagestan starting his own car repair business. Tamerlan wanted a U.S. passport because it was a valuable commodity, whatever he thought of American politics. He disliked a lot about the United States, but not enough to reject the prized passport. His landlady asked them to move out, gave them a formal eviction notice. She didn't like the fact they were taking financial help and bad-mouthing the government. She urged him to get a better education than just car repair because he was really smart. His brother Jahar was in a dorm, and he had a roommate named Andrew. Now, Andrew was the quintessential nerd. He was studious and socially awkward, very neat, always on schedule. Meanwhile, Zahar was the campus pot dealer. He met two guys, Kazakhs, who were at school, who spoke Russian, and they were better off than Jahar. He helped them to buy a car, for example, because he helped them to pick it out. They paid for it. One of their fathers was supporting him totally, and they thought it was really funny to get a license plate that said Terrorista #1. Haha. They all shared together, this group of friends, a cellular phone plan, a family plan, because Jahar was the only one who was a citizen with a social security number. So he got a family plan and put them on it. Jahar was now hanging around with these social misfit group, and he was the only one who could pass as white because he looked Chechnyan. He was very pale and he had dark hair. The rest of them looked more ethnic, and in the time that they were there, 70% of the students at the University of Massachusetts were white. If he'd gone back to Chechnya, they would immediately have known. If he had gone back to Russia, Moscow, for instance, they would immediately know he was Chechnyan, and he would have stood out as a minority there. So he would have gotten hostile stares and police scrutiny. However, after 9/11, scrutiny of Muslims had increased, and we're going to talk about that. It's pretty bad. I had no idea how bad it was. But he wasn't observant. He didn't benefit from being in the Muslim community. He didn't make social ties. His friend group wasn't academic. They were all into pot. And his grades started slipping. He seemed very lost when he was noticed by Larry Aronson, who was a teacher. Tamerlan, and we'll get back to that. Tamerlan skipped the Dagestan common social connection for immigrants and families. He just didn't connect with anybody. He seemed socially awkward too. He showed Gadzhiev his long beard and said, back home, they're talking on the computer, and he says, look, I've grown my beard here in Boston, but if I were back home, I'd be executed for Wahhabism. He became outspoken. He started going to the mosque, and he staged a walkout in the mosque, and he got removed for objecting to the imam celebrating non-Muslim holidays like Turkey Day and Martin Luther King Day, his family still made excuses for him. So here he is, he's semi-divorced, one of his wives. He's uneducated. He's living with his parents, working part-time as a pizza delivery / drug dealer. And now he's getting all critical. He's suddenly discovered the mosque, and he's getting all critical there that they're not radical enough. And his family was still making excuses about what a great guy he was. So on January 23rd, he applied for the naturalization and changed his name to Muaz in honor of a Dagestani leader of the Chechnyan Caucasian Empire. Jahar was still selling pot, and he did something that was unusual. He got all his friends to go with him one night to the river outside school, and he set off a huge fireworks display. Very unusual, and it was also completely illegal. Just a little thing to remember. In March, he told his friends that he knew how to make a bomb. He also said that things in the Quran were worth fighting for. And they didn't think a lot about it because Jahar was always getting stoned and sitting around and being a philosopher and saying stupid things. He had a penchant for random announcements that made no sense, that were not really attached to anything anybody else was talking about. And they asked him, did he think that his brother might be a Muslim fanatic? Nobody thought so. They all thought he was a drug dealer is what they thought. Patriots Day, 1775. The battles of Lexington and Concord, started out the Revolutionary War. And there were 3 states in the country that celebrated them, including Massachusetts. I didn't look up the other 2. I'm going to take a wild guess. I'm going to say Connecticut and, I don't know, Delaware? Pennsylvania? I don't know. I can't. Somebody look it up. Anyway, Patriots Day, big deal in Boston. They do reenactments of the battles of Lexington and Concord. The Red Sox traditionally, this is baseball, traditionally have their home opening game. All the stores are shut, all the businesses are closed, and they run the Boston Marathon. It's kind of like a second 4th of July. So April 15th was Patriots Day in 2013. And a couple of hours after the first person, the winner, crossed the finish line of the marathon at 2:49, 2 bombs exploded in the street near the finish line and killed 3 people and injured 264. 16 of them lost limbs. So, chapter 8, They Are Us. So after the bomb, all the videos that were taken, store videos, were scanned in the crowd for anyone who looked Muslim, dark, or non-white profile, right? One of those people that they targeted was Abdul Rahman Ali Al-Harbi, a 20-year-old Saudi. He had been injured. He was an English language student, and he'd been on his way to lunch with friends and happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. And he was badly burned. He was burned on his head, back, and legs. He went into an ambulance to get to a hospital. He was followed by a bunch of cops and FBI. At the hospital, he was surrounded by more than 20 cops and FBI. He was ID'd in the media as a suspect, and a photo of his home was put in the New York Post. And let me read this to you. Fox reported his name, and other media published a mistranslation of a Facebook post he'd written. God is coming to the U.S. is what they said it was. But what he had really written was, thank God I arrived in the U.S. after a long trip. CBS stated that a spectator at the marathon had seen him acting suspiciously and tackled him. And then they reported he had burns on his hands, probably from handling the bomb. He was exonerated by the FBI within 24 hours, but by this time he had no home because his address was so widely published he was unsafe. He had no money. The FBI never gave him back his wallet. The Saudi embassy had to provide him with food and a hotel room. Then came these other people, 2 Moroccan immigrants, a 17-year-old high school track competitor, his 24-year-old coach, who'd been fingered by online amateur detectives. They were named. They were put in the paper because they had a black backpack. Sunil Tripathi was one of them. He was a brown-skinned American student at Brown University. So he was targeted. He was named. His face was put on the internet. And they found that actually he'd been dead for weeks, and his body was found a couple weeks after this. And it doesn't say what happened to him. I'm assuming suicide, but it doesn't say that specifically. I don't want to contribute to the lies. But this is just an example of people being singled out who had absolutely nothing to do with anything. So Larry Aronson knew 3 people who lost limbs, friends of friends, acquaintances, work people. And when he saw the photo that they published on television of the 2 men who were suspected, he thought one looked just like his student Jahar. The hospital receptionist recognized Tamerlan as the pizza delivery guy who came to the hospital. This is one of the women working at the hospital after the bombing. Realized that guy in the picture is the guy who delivers our pizzas. But she was afraid to say anything. She was afraid she'd get dragged into being a witness and be targeted. A number of University of Massachusetts Dartmouth students saw the pictures of Jahar, and they couldn't believe it because he and his brother were so, as they put it, so normal. They didn't seem like what's been described as fanatics or whatever. So there was no sign. Surely they would have known. This assumption is a misconception. Psychiatrist and political scientist Gerald Post, who's been studying terrorists for decades, says terrorists are not depressed, severely emotionally disturbed, or crazed fanatics. Their primary shared characteristic is their normalcy, insofar as we understand the term. Psychological studies of terrorism are virtually unanimous at this point. Nor do they behave out of character just before committing an act to them, which appears perfectly rational and fully justified. On September 11th, one of the hijackers called his wife in Germany on the morning of the attack to tell her he loved her. She heard nothing unusual in his voice. Having made the decision to commit an act of terrorism, the future bomber, even a suicide bomber, develops, it would appear, a sort of 2-track mind. On one track, life goes on exactly as before. On the other, he is preparing for the event that will disrupt his life or even end it. It is precisely the ordinary nature of the man and the extraordinary effect of the act about to be committed that ensure that the 2 tracks never cross. So when these students saw the pictures of their friend, they recognized him but could not believe it. It was like their minds went 2 ways. We couldn't believe it was him. They went to his room. They stood outside. It was locked. They knocked and it was empty. And in the time between the bombing and the FBI picture putting out, he'd been seen on campus. So like after the bombing, he was seen on campus. This is before his picture went public. And he seemed absolutely normal. He commented on the bombing on Facebook. He socialized as usual. He didn't say anything unusual about the bombing. His picture was released, and his friend texted Jahar, who said, he texted back and said, listen, take what you want from my room because I can't write now, man. I can't. That was the last he was heard of. The roommate, Andrew, the nerd, let a group of 3 friends into the room, one of them called Diaz, and they went and they poked around in the room because he had said, take whatever you want. He went in and they found a backpack with hollowed out fireworks. The gunpowder was all gone from them. And also a half-empty jar of Vaseline, and actually they knew that you could use gunpowder and Vaseline to create an explosion. And they said to each other, I think he used these to make the bombs. So his friend took the backpack with that stuff. They took his computer and a thumb drive, an ashtray, a bag of pot, and headphones that actually belonged to one of the friends that Jahar had stolen. And he also took a red baseball cap of Jahar's. And while they were in there, the roommate texted Jahar, and they got no answer. So what they were doing is trying to take evidence away of pot. They didn't want the cops to know that he smoked pot. But also this bag with the fireworks, they felt like, this is going to get our friend in trouble. This was a really poor decision on this part, as we will come to find out. So the FBI was on the hunt. They attributed every violent crime that day to these 2 brothers. There was a robbery at a 7-Eleven. They blamed them. The brothers actually did carjack a guy who was named Danny in the media. He escaped. His car was a new Mercedes, and the brothers did not know that the car had GPS. Now, keep in mind something that we talk about a lot later in the book. The brothers went about their daily lives until their pictures went on TV. And then they were like, oh my God, the FBI is after us. That's when they ran. And there's a huge question mark about all of this, which we'll come to find out. So they wandered aimlessly. They had no plan. They didn't know they were going to be running from the FBI. They did have with them, though, according to the FBI, 5 homemade bombs, a semi-automatic gun, a machete, and a hunting knife. Tamerlan bragged to the guy who they carjacked, Danny. He bragged about the bombing. So they got cornered in this residential neighborhood, and there was a shootout with the cops, and a cop got shot by friendly fire. I love that term. So Orwellian. One of the cops shot one of the other cops. Jahar threw the bombs at the cops. The cops managed to tackle Tamerlan, and Jahar jumped in the car, and in his attempt to escape, he ended up driving over the cops and his brother and dragged his brother 30 feet, which essentially killed him. The cops cuffed him, but when he got to the hospital, he was dead. Jahar, meanwhile, drove off. Then he ditched the car and ran into a suburb, so the whole entire area went into lockdown. The friends with Jahar's stuff had not realized that this was evidence of a crime. I mean, they thought, oh, he's going to get in trouble when the cops find this, but not because they thought he, was necessarily a mad bomber, but because he was an immigrant and he had things that looked bad. Even though they said that about the bomb, and I think that might have been their undoing. But they tossed the bag with the fireworks and the Vaseline and a dumpster, and they kept the computer. So his friends freaked out about maybe possibly being questioned, so they all started to avoid the university campus. But the FBI, being the FBI, they tracked them down. They were all 3 of them were sitting in a room, in a kitchen, and waiting for the FBI to show up, and suddenly noticed all these little red dots on their shirts and all these agents outside with guns aimed at them. So the apartment was surrounded, but Jahar still had not been found, and the entire neighborhood was sheltered in place, and they did a house-to-house search, and these kids were roughed up. They were searched. They were put in separate cop cars. Sarnev's apartment building was raided, and all the renters were pushed out by the cops and then not allowed to go back in. The shelter-in-place order finally got lifted, and when it was lifted, a guy went to his backyard and found a blood trail to a boat he had parked in the yard, and Jahar was inside and was arrested. So part 3 is called The Aftermath, Chapter 9, How Musa, here we go, Musa Kadzimuratov fell out of love with America. So immigrants knew that this was going to be a catastrophe for Chechens in the United States. This one woman was really worried because her husband, although not a friend of Tamerlan's, had peripherally played soccer with a group. So 2 days later, the FBI came for her husband, and the ACLU lawyer stepped in and tried to help them, and the FBI let him go. They were very harsh with the people that they arrested. They went after all these random immigrants for various reasons. We're talking immigrants from Russia, immigrants from specifically Chechnya, and Muslims. They were sleep deprived. They were not allowed water. They were not allowed medication. They were hooded. And whether or not this was legal has not ever been decided by SCOTUS, by the Supreme Court. So the war on terror, any war on terror, is a war on emotions, and it's not conducive to success, but it's to change people's attitudes. The enemy is not terror. The enemy is terrorism, which is politically motivated violence. Obama redefined it as a war, the war on terror, that is. He redefined it as a war against Al-Qaeda. But it was shapeless. When would it be over? And Gessen spends a few pages just sort of musing about the situation. Terrorism always produces an outsized emotional response. For example, a 19-year-old on foot devolves into a major urban area on total lockdown. Calling it war made the legalities of what the government did mushy, as she puts it. There's an ill-defined enemy. The parameters of how the government is allowed to behave are indistinct. Following the September 11th attacks, the president claimed the right to detain anyone, including U.S. citizens, on American soil indefinitely without charges. And since this was war, the president also wanted detainees who were not U.S. citizens but who may have been longtime legal residents. They wanted them tried by military tribunals, which would have extraordinary powers and whose proceedings would be closed to the public. Some of Bush's more far-reaching measures were rolled back over the following few years, but the practice of targeting non-citizens, investigative profiling on the basis of immigration status in Department of Justice terminology, persisted. This happened in part because, unlike such extraordinary measures as the indefinite detention of citizens, the indefinite detention of non-citizens in practice required no change in the law. For the majority of the more than 1,200 aliens detained in the wake of September 11th, visa violations or other immigration status irregularities could be found to justify detention. For the rest, a novel way of applying an existing statute was introduced. Simply by being non-citizens, they became, in the eyes of the law, witnesses who might not be available to testify unless detained. Testifying before the National Commission on Terrorist Activities attacks upon the U.S. in December of 2003, this guy pointed to this cycle, detention, closed hearing, and deportation, as one of the greatest threats to liberty contained in new anti-terrorist policy and practice, calling it what amounts to a claim of the right to make individuals disappear from American society on executive orders and without the public openness that is necessary for trust in the legitimacy of your government. Okay. The Department of Homeland Security was created, vastly powerful. Aliens became a target, non-citizens from Chechnya especially, but these brothers were not from Chechnya, and Jahar was a citizen. Musa Kazimuratov. Now, he was an obvious subject. He had fought in the Chechen insurgency, and he owned guns. He lived in New Hampshire, where Tamerlan had gone to practice shooting at a range and to buy fireworks. Tamerlan had visited Musa 3 weeks before the bombing. But there were Chechen customs, and Musa was seriously disabled. He had been hurt in Chechnya fighting. He was in a wheelchair, and he had almost constant seizures that he needed to be medicated for. He couldn't get a green card because of fighting in the insurgency, but he did have refugee status because of fighting in the insurgency. The FBI came for him, wheelchair and all, and said he was suspect because he spent all day on Skype with family back home. Well, he didn't want to leave home. He had to leave home. And he kept his ties at home by looking on the computer all day. The FBI thought he was the mastermind of the bombing. So they held him for questioning. This is a disabled man. And after 8 hours with no medication, he started to become semi-comatose. Then they wanted to do a polygraph on him in this condition. And he finally realized, wait a minute. And he refused and he left. But they were pulling his apartment apart while this was going on. The main FBI threat, of course, was deportation. And they said, this makes no sense because 9/11 was planned from overseas. I mean, you can deport somebody. That doesn't stop terrorism. It's craziness. You're better off keeping them here where you can watch them closely. December 10th, oh my God, I'm losing my mind. Chapter 10, the strange death of Ibrahim Todashev, May 1st, 2013. 24-year-old Reni Manukyan was detained at JFK Airport by the Department of Homeland Security. She'd been visiting her cousins for a wedding in Moscow, 2 hours south of Moscow, and had a 12-hour trip back to the United States and got stopped at the airport. She realized that they were stopping Muslims, and she was interrogated about the Tsarnads, about Tamerlan and Jahar, and she didn't know anything about them. They asked her, did she know a guy called Ibrahim Todashev? Well, Ibrahim Todashev was her husband. They had they suspected him. And they suspected him because he was heavily into martial arts, boxing. So even though they were kind of divorced, they weren't legally divorced, they had sort of separated, but they were kind of dating again. I mean, she loved him, but he was obsessed with boxing. That was the issue. And so they were on the phone to each other all the time, and they saw each other every couple of weekends. And so she asked the interrogator, why? What did he do something? She was being flippant. And the response was, well, what do you think he would have done? And she thought, well, did he cheat on me? Did he get into a fight and get arrested? So she had no idea about the bombing. She'd been in Russia, in the wilds of Russia, 2 hours outside Moscow, in the middle of nowhere. So they interrogated her for 5 hours. And when she got released, she called him. And it turns out he knew Tamerlan from boxing. And that's why they were questioning her. So the next day, she had 2 jobs. She worked 16 hours a day as a motel maid. The next day, the FBI came to her work. And she told the FBI that she thought that they were trying to set him up, that Muslims and Chechens were being under siege in the United States. and they got nasty with her, and they said to her, "Oh, you think that he has the right to kill people?" So she was getting scared of the FBI. Ibrahim just got his green card, and he planned his first return visit to see his parents and 11 younger siblings since he'd come to the United States. She convinced him not to go. She was afraid they wouldn't let him back in the country. So all that evening, she called him and texted him and couldn't get a response. Now, she had converted, and she's an American, and her family thought she was nuts. Her mother had met this guy in Russia and had moved. Well, he was an American, and she met him online, and she was in Russia, the mother was Russian, and she moved to America with her 2 small children, including Rennie, and married the guy. And it only lasted 6 months, but she decided to stay in the United States. So what did her mother do? Her mother joined the Army because it gave her immigration security. It would give her job training and medical insurance and citizenship and a retirement. And so eventually she had a really good career in the Army. And the Army sent her to Germany with her son. At that point, Rennie was 20 years old, and she stayed in the United States. And she was a confused, immature 20-year-old. She changed her name to that of the Armenian man that she believed was her real father, although her mother denied it. Then she converted, so she was seeking. Ibrahim was a nice guy. He had gotten political asylum. The mother liked him. She just thought, yeah, you can marry this guy, but he just needs to get a real job. This boxing thing is ridiculous. So the mother in the Army was living in Savannah with the Army and closing on her first home on April 15th when the bombs went off. Then the daughter got questioned. Ibrahim got questioned and followed, and then more questioning, and then they couldn't get a hold of him. The next day, going to work, Rennie realized she was being followed, and it was being followed by the FBI. They were being really obvious and really intimidating, intentionally. And then they told her that her husband, Ibrahim, was dead. He had died of gunshots. So she totally freaked out and called her mother-in-law and her mother and said, they killed him. The FBI story was that they had sat in his apartment with him and were questioning him. And he got aggressive. They didn't really have a story. Elena, this is the mother, the Russian mother in the Army. Elena remembers the FBI saying, he placed his foot up on the chair right next to where I was sitting and he hiked his pants leg up. This is Elena saying the FBI agent did this to her. He had a gun strapped to his shin. He said, if you touch my gun now, my partner can kill you. He has that right. The gun was just about level with my face. It's a good thing I didn't reach for it then or I wouldn't be talking to you today. So this is how, everybody thinks the FBI is such great guys. This is how they treat people. So, we still don't know what happened to Ibrahim. It's not clear. He had been interviewed 3 times by the FBI. Once while lying on the cement with his hands behind his back outside his condo, which was called voluntary. He actually had a girlfriend. So, he's fooling around, not the most faithful of characters. And they didn't realize that this Tatiana character was his girlfriend. The mother thought it was his roommate, and Rennie thought it was his best friend's girlfriend. So he was under constant surveillance. They even used drones. They took all his electronics away from him, and they arrested his girlfriend, Tatiana. She was arrested for a visa violation. And let me explain something about visa violations. Now, I'm an American citizen, a naturalized citizen, and I know for a fact that people from Ireland, young people especially, come over usually to the East Coast, New York, Boston area, on student visas or work permit visas. And they get a job as a bartender or a waitress, hotel maid, just to kind of offset their travel. And so they can see the United States and it helps to pay for the trip. Sometimes they make romantic connections or friendship connections or employment connections, and they don't want to go back. And they outstay the extent of their visa. So they're working, They're paying taxes. They're not committing crimes, but technically they're here illegally. This happens to a lot of people. And it can be fixed. You can, if you're Irish, you're better off than if, let's say, you're from, Mexico, because quotas, right? And you can just apply for immigration and try to get some kind of a visa to come over as an immigrant. But young people are often irresponsible about paperwork, and they just sort of, blow it off. Well, this is what happens to a lot of people here in this story. They probably should have been more aware of the tenuous situation they were in because of the place in the world they were from. But they weren't necessarily up to no good. They were just irresponsible about paperwork. And boy, oh boy, did that cause troubles. So Tatiana gets arrested because of her visa in Orlando. The boyfriend also lives in Orlando. And the FBI came to question him. And they said that they were scared of him. He was a boxer, right? They intimidated him, though. He asked his friend to be there when the FBI came. Now, the FBI came with like 8 guys the first time. And the second time they came with, I think, 4 FBI and 2 state troopers. And he wanted his friend to stay in the room with him in the apartment because he was afraid of the FBI. And they said, no, he can't be in the room. So they took the friend out to the parking lot and started giving him the 3rd degree. And they questioned this guy, Ibrahim, for hours. And everything was going fine. And finally, the cops say, this is where it gets weird. Remember the 3 friends of Tamerlan's who died? They were murdered. Their 3 bodies were found with their hands behind their backs, their throats slit. They'd been dealing drugs. They were found with pot and money, right? In Boston. This guy, Ibrahim, according to the FBI, after hours of interrogation and intimidation by 6 guys, confessed to killing Tamerlan's friend and in 211, and then went berserk, tried to attack the cops, and they shot him. That's the story. Never been investigated. Rennie says that he wasn't in Boston at the time, and she would have been able to prove it, that she had credit card records proving that he was spending money not in Boston at the time, but by the time of the Boston bombings, the official bank records were gone. Ibrahim his alleged written confession, it totally doesn't agree with the facts of the murder. It's like he wasn't there, he didn't know the details of the murder. And Remy says it was in his handwriting. But that doesn't mean you can't be forced to write a confession. So she flew his body back to Russia, which was a huge paperwork nightmare. I won't go into it. She was subjected to a full body search at the airport before she left. And she decided not to return to the United States. She stayed in Russia. So the final report on all of this, Ibrahim, the 3 dead guys, is the FBI acted legally, and the officers said that they were afraid of Ibrahim, that he was a formidable fighter. And the text of the FBI agent after the shooting was revealed. He texted other cops, and it seems like he was bragging about the shooting of Ibrahim and celebrating that also this same cop had a record of falsifying reports, and he had been sued for physical assaults on suspects when he worked for the Oakland police. Later became an FBI agent. So Rennie's mom in the military was under investigation and hassled, and they made things so awful for her with the army that she had no choice. She had to retire at the age of 44. She says that the U.S. secret police, as she calls them, are just like the ones in Russia, and they would kill their own people in a second if it fit their narrative. So here's the interesting thing. The online community, there is a large online community that defends the Sarnoff brothers and says that they were set up. So chapter 11, everyone is going to jail. The friends of Zahar, Azamat, and the other two were detained, handcuffed, and interrogated for 8 hours. And they were afraid they were going to get caught for pot, so they lied about everything. So they got arrested for a visa violation, that very important post 9/11 tool. His dad had lots of money, and he flew from Kazakhstan. He got a lawyer, and he got a fancy Boston immigration lawyer and a New York City criminal lawyer. And Zahar's friends served 10 days in jail before they actually had an immigration hearing. But then they didn't show up in court because the whole thing got continued for another week. I mean, they're toying with these kids. The FBI filed criminal complaints against them for impeding investigations and for hiding evidence. Azamat finally saw his dad. He told his father the whole truth, and he refused to lie about his friends. He said, no, we didn't do anything wrong. We went to the dorm room. We found the stuff. We just didn't want our friend to get in trouble for pot, and we threw it all away. We didn't realize fully that, that this had anything to do with a bombing. Azamat went on trial. His dad was harassed and followed by the FBI. He finally had to he moved 6 times in 6 months because they made things so unpleasant for the landlords and the neighbors, and he had to rent cars and take Ubers. And then the FBI agents lied on the stand. One friend of theirs pled guilty for hiding evidence because they threw the backpack in the trash. And they got 7 years in federal penitentiary. The best deal went to the American friend. He got the easiest sentence. They got charged with obstruction. The backpack was actually found by them a week after Jahar was arrested. So this is all very strange. And the friends got 25 years in prison. The cab driver, Azamat's father called a cab, and the cab driver who gave his father a ride was arrested. He was also an immigrant. He had been being watched by the FBI, not because he'd done anything, but by his profile, because he was an immigrant. And any kind of contact with any of these people, these brothers, their friends, and then the dads and all, made them guilty by association. He was accused of meeting with the Tsarnevs often and expressing support for the bombs. His crime was, he said, I do not know if Tamerlan had extremist views. He knew him from seeing him casually at the mosque. And he was accused of not going to the FBI and telling them that that was Tamerlan. His real crime was trying to hide something else. The roommates were trying to hide pot. He was trying to hide the fact that he had pirated videos on his computer. Made him look shifty. He was very confused and very scared. He was arrested. And he was in federal detention without bail, and his trial was scheduled for 2015, so there's no further information about that. Chapter 12, What Will We Know? So this is a scary story to believe that only a couple of people were involved in such a horrible event, that this was just a choice consistent with their values. There was no huge conspiracy, no big long-term terrorist plot. It was very uncomplicated. Americans want to believe that terrorism is the result of radicalization. But the friend Gadziev, told Gessen that he just objected to U.S. foreign policy. It was a rational choice consistent with his values. The media coverage drives Americans' understanding of terrorism. The FBI claims the roots of terrorism are in radicalization, but people who really understand that know that it's not true. After the bombings, they went searching for what radicalized them, and they were never able to accept the fact that they simply didn't like U.S. foreign policy. Their families and friends have suffered extreme fallout. That the simple explanation for all of this is rejected because they need to seek something more dramatic in explanation in proportion to the response that they experienced. I mean, there was just so much harassment. 25 years for a college kid for throwing a backpack out because he was an idiot, you know. He was not a criminal mastermind. And so this developed into a big conspiracy theory, and it was one conspiracy theory with a couple of variants. The first is that the bombings were organized by Putin's FSB, which is like the KGB, to blame Chechens as a false flag and to create a contrast to the multiple bombings inside Russia that had made the Olympic Committee reluctant to OK Sochi in 2014. So there was this fear, we can't let Russia have the Olympics because they cannot guarantee security, because look at all the bombings in Russia. So Putin creates bombings elsewhere and says, well, you're not so good with your security, and it's these stupid Chechens. Of course, it gives them an opportunity to go after them. So the FSB, the Russians, enticed the brothers to bomb the Boston Marathon. And this would make the Chechens look like a big international threat, and it would peripherally would increase American support for the Russian crackdown in Chechnya. We wouldn't feel so bad about it. America couldn't protect its own sporting events, so why would it criticize the Russians for not being able to support their own? The FSB was tracking Tamerlan since 2011, and some argue that they trained him and sent him back to the U.S. to bomb. Also, interestingly enough, Putin was one of the very first world leaders to offer condolences about the bombing. The FBI is behind the bombing. This is the second theory, that the FBI was tracking Tamerlan in 2011 with the goal of imposing martial law, and they wanted to test could they ever impose martial law, and they used this bombing when they did lock down the area to see how that would go. Conspiracy theorists say that there was a third person involved. Some say that the police stories are inconsistent. It was a very confusing event, and she goes through it. I just didn't bother. It's too much. There is a lot of confusion. Suffice it to say that there is no clear answer of what really happened. The brothers were convicted in public opinion long before the one that was alive, Jahar, ever made it to court. They acted completely normally after the bombing. They did nothing bizarre until their faces went on TV. Then they began to run from the cops, but they knew that they had been harassed by the, because of being immigrants and Islamists. So this is used as proof of their guilt. Jahar left a note inside the boat where he was hiding saying that he was explaining their motivation. So he says that he did it and that it had to do with the words of the Quran being true. And he didn't say we did the bomb, but he also didn't say how it got made, and it didn't say if he had help. It was just this weird, vague thing that he wrote inside this boat. Where did it go? The U.S. government is killing our innocent civilians, but most of you already know that. I can't stand to see such evil go unpunished. We Muslims are one body. You hurt one, you hurt us all. And then he goes on to talk about Muhammad and fighting men and going to heaven. And I don't like the killing of innocent people. It's forbidden in Islam. but due to something that they couldn't read the word, it is allowed. Stop killing our innocent people, and we will stop. And then it says if the court of public opinion could be held to the standard of reasonable doubt, then someone would have to ask its jury this question. Is it conceivable that the Tsarnaev brothers were not the marathon bombers, but once they knew they were the suspects, they decided to run? The answer would have to be yes, that is conceivable. The evidence available to the public before the trial included nothing that directly linked the Tsarnaev brothers to the bombing or explained its mechanics or the brothers' motivations. Gessen assumes that they did it. She's not saying that they didn't do it. She's just trying to make some sense out of it. How did they come to such an act? The older sister, the Canadian lawyer, said that it was a secret police plot, and then the sister disappeared. Family and friends found it impossible to believe because they seemed so normal, but Gessen makes the point once again. Terrorists are normal. The outstanding common characteristic of terrorists is their normality. This is from an 1981 study by Martha Crenshaw, the pioneer in the study of terrorism. They're usually in their early 20s, often immigrants, educated in secular schools, usually married, middle class, but marginalized. They have a small social circle of marriage, family, friends, and a terror network. Political conditions that enable terrorism is that a large group will be excluded from the political process. There's increased tolerance for risk-taking from them because they've grown up around war zones or high-crime areas. However, most people like this do not resort to violence. The Boston Globe said that Tamerlan is a schizophrenic. This is another theory. This is based on a decades-long game of telephone, is how I described it. He said to him, she said to them. Nobody ever actually followed through and got the full story, but they claimed that, he heard voices. Well, the people that claim this didn't know him. They heard it from. And it's counterfactual because schizophrenics are usually too disorganized to carry out a plot like this. Terrorist activities require the ability to plan and organize. Many had theories of those they believed that had radicalized Tamerlan, but a responsible investigation shows that he didn't know them and that they weren't involved in anything. So 40% of the FBI operating budget is the focus of 40% of the FBI budget is terrorism. Real attacks between 2001 and 2013 are 0. Fake plots that the FBI created to bait and catch suspects are in the dozens, and hundreds of people were jailed. So I'm not going to read from the book because I'm on limited time here with my recording. But what the book has to say, which you can read if you want to know, is that the FBI has undergone a systematic program of surveilling, hounding, arresting, questioning, detaining, deporting, just harassing certain immigrants from certain parts of the world. And it's not based on specific knowledge that they've done anything. It's 100% profiling. And they actually set up fake situations to get them into trouble for other things, drug selling and that sort of stuff, so that they can ratchet up the threats and get them to lie about other people. And what she is saying is, she says in the book, the FBI creates terrorists in its zeal to catch terrorists. During this time, Whitey Bulger was on trial, and the FBI had used Whitey Bulger for 15 years as an informant and ignored his crimes, including murder, for the information that he gave them and a cut of his proceeds. That's proof. The more complicated conspiracy theory involves a proven Watertown, Waltham, Boston area drug ring that got the protection of the cops in exchange for money. And this could have involved Tamerlan. He had friends who dealt drugs, the 3 that were killed, and he claimed that crooked cops killed his friend. Brendan Mess is the name of the friend, who was murdered. And this has never been fully investigated by the DA. And the DA was a boxer in the same place that Tamerlan was. So there's also a CIA coincidence. If you remember, Anzor's brother, Ruslan, Tamerlan's uncle, worked for the U.S. government programs with the CIA. And then the theory, this conspiracy theory, is that Tamerlan came to the USA at the behest of the CIA. Gessen's theory, and the facts that she uses, are that in 2011, the FSB, Russia, wrote a letter to the FBI about Tamerlan and said, oh, here, on a silver platter, here's a Chechnyan terrorist, because they just hated Chechnyans. And they wanted to implicate Chechnyans in the eyes of the American government. So they were pointing fingers at bad Chechnyans. And so there's a cooperation here with the FBI's war on terror. And usually the names that they gave were pointless. The FSB was doing it for window dressing to seem like they were cooperating. So Tamerlan fit the FBI profile, a young immigrant with no steady job, Russian-speaking Muslim, perfect. Actually, the family had been questioned by the FBI every single year since 2002, which is the standard experience for people from suspect countries. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, etc., etc. In 2011, the FBI came 3 times and tried to recruit Tamerlan to work undercover for them. His 3 friends were killed, and the explanation is, these are the choices. Nobody knows. Here are your choices. Tamerlan killed them while working for the FBI, and he killed them for other reasons, but because he was working for the FBI covered it up. Explanation number 2, Tamerlan did it on the orders of the cops. Explanation number 3, the cops did it. Nobody knows. In 2012, Tamerlan went to Dagestan, and he lied about why he was going to renew his passport. Really, he was trying to find a better place to live, restless, itchy feet. 6 months later, he said he was called back to the U.S. because of his documents. Now, he was warned that he needed to return or he would not be allowed back in as a political asylee because he still didn't have his U.S. passport. So this sort of warning could only come from one place, and that would be the FBI. So he comes back to the U.S. and ends up being a house husband and got bored and got spending time on the internet, and he went rogue is basically what happened. So how did the FBI not recognize these brothers in the surveillance photographs when they had seen them at least once a year, sometimes more, for almost 10 years, and had offered Tamerlan to work with them? They knew him. How did that happen? How is that possible? Did they pretend not to know? To disguise that they had tried to recruit him or had him as an informer? Or what? But people had reported them. People had called the FBI hotline and said, these are the Tsarnaev brothers. The FBI seemed to be surveilling Central Square in Cambridge, where the MIT cop was shot during the lockdown thing. So they had been lying in wait for the brothers to show up. But then they denied that they were there. So they claimed that they were there. They denied that they were there for the Tsarnaevs. They said, well, we were there for something else, but we're not going to tell you what. They claimed they didn't identify the Tsarnaevs until Tamerlan died. But they'd been named in tips, and they were known to the FBI, intimately known to the FBI. Rumor had it that he may even have been working with the FBI. 100% the FBI tried to recruit him. So the best explanation is the FBI was covering up something by killing Tamerlan themselves. And why did Ibrahim Todashev die? His wife says it was planned. Why would law enforcement want him dead? FBI says they were afraid of him in the bombing, but there's no answer to this. I'm just throwing this stuff out here. She's throwing it out there. There's no answer. In the bombing, the Boston bombing, where did the bombs come from? A grand jury assumed that the brothers learned from some website. But there's one called Make a Bomb in the Kitchen of Your Mom. But the experts told Gessen that this is probably impossible, that the kind of stuff that was in the bombs, you would get microscopic particles of it everywhere when you made it. They were never able to find any of it in any place the brothers had ever been. Okay, so there were 500 people tried in the U.S. courts on terrorism in the last 12 years. Jahar was the only one to make a real bomb instead of getting involved in fake things that the FBI concocted to catch terrorists. So no one knows where the bomb was made, who made it, how it was made. For the brothers, there's no extraordinary event to explain what happened. They happened to be born in the wrong place at the wrong time. They didn't feel they belonged here. They felt opportunity had passed them by. They grabbed on to the opportunity to do something big. Jihad offers group pride in a great achievement for the underachieving. The U.S. government rhetoric has helped to create jihadists. It's targeted communities, caused resentments, and created jihadists. For Tamerlan, this would have been a path to greatness. And Jahar had to stand trial for declaring war on a great power, this young kid. So the epilogue of the book, she said that the winter of 2014-2015, there was an epic blizzard, which was a huge disaster in Boston. Jahar was held in prison with special administrative measures, which he's allowed only phone calls with his lawyer and his family. They are all monitored. They're required to only speak English. They get no physical contact. He's allowed 1 3-page letter a week, which has to be in English and only between him and his family. The ACLU is not allowed to help him. There's a 74-page indictment with 30 counts against him, and 17 get the death penalty. So the book was written before the results. If he got the death penalty, it would mobilize new enemies to avenge him. She said the jury was absolutely not his peers. It was really alarming to see how the jury was picked. 68% of the people who were seated on the jury said they believed he was guilty before they were sat on the jury. So he was convicted in 2015. I looked this up. It's not in the book. He was convicted in 2015. He got the death sentence. Then it was overturned. And then it was reinstated in March 2022. And I don't know what his status is now, if that can be changed or not. So I hope you enjoyed this book. This is an interesting book with a lot of food for thought. No one's saying they didn't do it. What this book is saying is, look at what life is like for people, and you can be a victim of circumstance that can turn you into something other than a victim. And law enforcement is not always what it pretends to be. And there's a lot of nefarious stuff going on underneath the surface. And there are a lot of answers that are not pursued because it wouldn't benefit the powers that be to get answers. And at the end of this, we come out with 3 dead people and a lot of injured people, some very gravely injured for life, and a 19-year-old with a death sentence hanging over his head. And it's an interesting study in human psychology and political malfeasance and behavior in general. It's a really good book, The Brothers, The Road to an American Tragedy. So I would recommend it. I love Masha Gessen. Great books. Wonderful writer. Thank you very much for watching. And I'll be back tomorrow for some cards, some questions. And in the meantime, slanga foil and slancha.